In our first section, we invited 3 speakers to share international experience of biodiversity conservation. And here we can see 3 of them. And they will walk us through different conservation practice in different continents. And also, like after their sharing, we're gonna have 10 to 15 minutes open for question and discussion. So if you have any questions, please save for later. And our first stop, we will follow Dr. Genevieve Campbell to West Africa. Dr. Campbell is the primatologist by training, and she has great experience and many years of experience in Africa about biodiversity conservation. And also she knows a lot of conservation issues over there, and she has a lot of experience. And she is also supporting the activities of the IUCN Species Survival Commission Primate Specialist Group section on great apes. And she will share with us their practice to mitigate threats from industrial development on great apes. And welcome Dr. Campbell. Thank you.
So thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you for the invitation to present today on the threats from industrial development project on great ape. And I will focus also more on West Africa for the part of the presentation. So when we talk about great ape, we talk about chimpanzee, bonobo, gorilla, and orangutan. They range in 23 countries. So we can see on the map everything that's colored red, blue, orange, yellow, that's the range of the great ape, and in green is the range of humans. So we see that humans were much more successful at expanding their range on Earth, and the great ape are then really threatened, so there's not much space for them to survive. All of the species of great ape are listed as either endangered or critically endangered, so that's on the IUCN Red List. So if you look to the right, the different categories, so endangered and critically endangered are the 2 last category before they go extinct in the wild. And all of the population of chimpanzee, bonobo, gorilla, and orangutan, all of the numbers left of their population, total less than 1 million individual. So that's less than the city of Montreal that you're in at the moment. And it's also less than 1% of the human population. That we are now 8 billion on the planet, and there's less than 1 million great ape remaining in the wild. We normally categorize threats to their population in 3 categories: poaching, habitat loss, and disease. So poaching can be for consumption or for trade when we trade live individual. The habitat loss can be sustainable agriculture or more large scale, for example, here, timber extraction. The disease can be naturally occurring within their population or can be also transmitted by human. And industrial development project, what they do is they exacerbate all of these threats to their population. And when we talk about industrial development project, we talk about renewable energy, for example, hydroelectric dam, mining, solar power, agribusiness, so these large oil palm plantation. So these are usually occurring within great ape habitat, but are funded by external banks, which Canadian bank, Chinese bank, a lot of foreign banks that fund these projects that are occurring within great ape range, and they overlap significantly. So they occur in all the country where great ape are present, and they overlap significantly with their range. So here is an example with mining. So in blue is the African great ape range. So they're mainly Central Africa, East Africa, West Africa. And in yellow is the mining title that are either in exploration or exploitation. So we see there's a lot of overlap between these mining concession and our permit and the range of great ape. And it depends also, so they will have more overlap in certain countries than other where the resource is more abundant, but it's still quite a threat. And why these projects bring threat to great ape? So we normally talk about direct impact and indirect impact. So the direct impact of these projects is they're really related to the project themselves. So it could be through the pollution of water courses by, for example, mining activities, or the noise, the disturbance that the activity of the project occur within the range of the Great Ape. But more significant are usually indirect impact, and they're more difficult to quantify and often extend beyond the project footprint. So when we talk about indirect impact, there's a degree of separation with the project. So for example, it could be the influx of people coming to an area looking for work, again with a mining company, because they hire a lot of people, so people may be attracted to this area because they're looking for work, and not all of the people will be hired with the company, so then they stay around and then can start doing trade, bushmeat trade, or do crops, which are putting pressure on the habitat of the chimpanzee or great ape that are living in this area. And even a small impact for apes makes it difficult for the population to recover because they have really slow reproductive rate. So the interbirth interval for chimpanzee, for example, is between 4 and 8 years. So even if one individual is impacted, it's quite slow for the population to recover for a small impact. It's not like other species that can have several litter per year and with many individuals. So their reproduction is really slow. And now I'll focus a bit more on West Africa and on the Western chimpanzees. The Western chimpanzee is critically endangered. There's only about 50,000 individuals remaining. And one of the main cause for their decline is these type of industrial development project, which exacerbate, again, the threat to their population. So here on the map, you see in the light blue is the original range, the historical range, and in hash blue is the current range. So we see here in Ivory Coast, they've been extirpated from that country almost, and that's mainly due to one industry, the cocoa industry. And here we can see what this industry do. The main thing that is apparent is the deforestation. So here on the map, you see between 1990, 2015, Ivory Coast lost most of its forest cover. And that was the habitat for the chimpanzees. So it was difficult for them to survive without their habitat. But coupled to that, because there was people moving around in these forests, they also were doing hunting and doing the trade in chimpanzee or eating chimpanzees. So that also accelerated their decline in that country. So there's not just one industry present within their range, so there's many different industry. So here on the map to the left, all the points represent mining permits, again, that can be active or planned. So we see there's a lot of mining projects that can be developed within their range. But then coupled up to that, to the right, we have hydropower project. So all the points, again, are possible planned or current hydropower project. So we see there's a lot of overlap. And then you can add other industry, like I mentioned, the cocoa industry, oil palm industry. So there's many different industry. And so when you overlap all of these, there's not much space for chimpanzee to survive, and not much place to do conservation. And as I talked about the cocoa example, so that's something that's already had an impact on their population and reduced their range. But we can also anticipate threats. So now we know that these projects have impact on chimpanzees, and we can anticipate what are the trends in development. So now we're talking about this green revolution, and we want to move to rely a lot on renewable energy. But the renewable energy also have impact on biodiversity. And we also now are pushing all people to use more electric car. But the electric car also comes with other impact that we still need to be careful about. So for example, with the electric car, we can anticipate, so we know there will be, so by 2030, all new cars that will be sold needs to be electric. So that creates a big demand to make new cars. And with the electric car, there's higher proportion of aluminum because it's lighter metal. And so we know there's these trends of which metal will be needed. And so we know by 2030, there's 14 times more demand in aluminum that we're expecting. And so we know where aluminum comes from. It's from bauxite, and the largest reserve are in Guinea. So we know we're expected that in Guinea, there will be way more bauxite mine to provide for this demand in aluminum. So bauxite is transformed to alumina and then aluminum. And here in Canada, we are a big producer of aluminum, but we don't have any bauxite mine. So this bauxite we take from elsewhere. And that's for many countries the same. They may produce aluminum, but they don't have this, the first mineral that's needed, the bauxite. And so on the map, we see in Guinea, all the mining permit for bauxite. So that's mainly the western part of Guinea. And there's a lot of, the production has increased really rapidly because aluminum is really a cheap metal that's really in demand. That we say it's green because it can be recycled indefinitely without losing its property, but that's if we recycle it. And so we don't really recycle it. It's cheaper to get new bauxite. So it's not totally green metal. And unfortunately, that's also an area where there's a lot of chimpanzees. So there's really high density of the Western chimpanzee. In Guinea, there's 60% of the Western chimpanzee that remain, that harbor that subspecies. And we expecting that if it continue at this rate, just the aluminium industry alone could impact 50% of the Western chimpanzee. So it's quite a big threat to their population. And all of these mines are mainly belong to foreign investment, so foreign company, or sometimes also with foreign investment. So the Canada Export Bank, for example, Development Bank is funding such project. Chinese bank are funding project. There's a lot of different countries, foreign country active in these countries in Africa. So we need to better try to mitigate their impact there. And sometimes you can say, why not focus on biodiversity and pay specific attention to great ape? But with great ape, we want to make sure that their impact are well mitigated because they have quite complex socio-ecological system. So sometimes mitigating impact, maybe we want to make sure impact are well mitigated. All their population, as I mentioned, are endangered or critically endangered. They're really important for their ecosystem as seed disperser, and they're also often an umbrella species or keystone species, so that if their population start declining, it gives an alert to others, to the habitat that we know the habitat is not doing well. They're also really closely related to human. So sometimes there are ethical issue about how much impact and how much decline we can accept of their population that it's caused by human. And yeah, they're a good flagship species. We see here, I've seen at the COP for a lot of talks or side events, even if you talk about ecosystem or biodiversity in general, they will use a picture of a great ape to attract attention. So they're a good flagship species. And how can we mitigate impact of these projects? So a lot of it is in the best practice. And so that's been set mainly by bank, especially the International Finance Corporation. So they've included in their guidance a specific paragraph for great ape, so to make sure that the mitigation of impact to great ape is more well incorporated in the approach. Sometimes the company themselves can align with best practice, so they want to follow best practice. And when we talk about best practice, it's mainly the following of the mitigation hierarchy. So the mitigation hierarchy is 4-step, sequential step. That is first to avoid the main impact to biodiversity, then to reduce, to try to minimize, make minimization measure to minimize this impact even more, restore where you can, and then as a last resort, you offset what we call the residual impact. So that's not, a lot of companies can sometimes just jump into offset and give money to an organization, but we still need to make sure that the offset compensate for actual, that it's in relation to the significance of these impact. And I'm leading a task force that's within the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So they have different specialist group. So for different taxa, for primate, antelope, plants. So we are, the task force is within the primate specialist group. And there's the section on great ape. So within the section of great ape, we're about 200 members. And so with the task force, we're trying to advise company and trying to implement these best practice standard. So we've been active since 2016, and we're expanding a little bit. And we work in transparency, so all of our comments we upload on our website, so for anyone to have a look at. And we also try to build capacity of local primatologists to be able to advise these companies. And we also raise awareness, like what I'm doing today. So to conclude, we see there's a good trend, an encouraging trend that more and more banks and companies are trying to consider more their impact to great ape in their investment or with the project themselves, try to mitigate impact. And also a lot of companies are committed voluntarily to follow best practice and trying to minimize these impact to great ape. There's also offsetting that's coming in the legislation, so it's becoming legal in a lot of countries now within the range of great ape. So that's also encouraging, but we still need to make a lot of improvement.
10 years after reducing deforestation significantly by about 80% between 2004 and 2012, deforestation has been on the rise again, and indeed, especially under the current government. And so because of that, Brazil's total greenhouse gas emissions has also been increasing substantially. Of course, we need to put that into comparison to, and also in relation to what it means in terms of global emissions, about between 3 and 5% of the global emissions. But since the majority of those emissions are linked to land use change and deforestation in particular, and that has a very big biodiversity impact, that's why I think it's particularly relevant, especially for the context of this conference. And also, one thing we should take into the consideration that while quite often Brazil measures, and the way we measure deforestation in Brazil looks at clear-cut deforestation, so it's the direct conversion from forest into, let's say, agricultural use, the impact of degradation is actually much bigger than the impact of clear-cut deforestation directly. That's why, for instance, for every hectare of clear-cut deforestation for agriculture in Brazil, usually you have 2 hectares of areas being degraded for logging, and also with indirect impacts. And this has a major impact, especially for biodiversity, as well pointed by Dr. Campbell. And that's why, for instance, Barlow a few years ago have shown that when you take a parcel and you cut off 20% of that parcel, actually you have a reduction of the biodiversity value of the total area between 39 and 54%. So there is no direct relation between the area being deforested and the total area being impacted, especially for biodiversity, since the total area being impacted for biodiversity is much bigger. And this, and which is a point I would like to start to make here, has also impacts in terms of food production. Because if you look, for instance, at the case of Brazil, about 60% of the cultivated area depend on pollinators in order to produce food. So if we start reducing significantly, as we are, the environment where food is produced and where basically where we have biodiversity, then we also have, in fact, impact in the ability of produce food. And then when it comes to climate, we should separate between 2 different levels. One is global warming, so global climate change, but also we have regional climate change linked to deforestation. First, when you talk about global warming and the impacts expected up to the end of the century, we are expecting here to see significant reductions in the crop yields, especially in regions in Africa and in South America, that could reach more than 40%. So we are reaching a situation here where the ability of the Earth system to provide food for humanity is being threatened because of climate change by the end of the century, especially grains. Oops. Yeah. But also, most significantly to my talk here, we have the impact of local deforestation in regional climate change. Since the 70s, actually, Brazil has known that most of a significant portion of the rainfall that happens over the Amazon is not coming directly from the Atlantic Ocean. It's actually recycled through the forest, which means that Brazil, in which is a bit different from other countries, is able to have even thousands of kilometers away from the ocean, a very intense rainfall regime. However, when you cut down forest, you stop the ability to move moisture from the Atlantic Ocean into the heart of the continent, which, by the way, is the area where most of food is produced in Latin America. So, for instance, here we have this figure that shows that when you start cutting down forest, in terms of, for instance, of the percentage of area cut, we have a direct impact on the volume of rainfall that happens in that area. And not only that, we have observed, and this was an article published in Nature Climate Change recently, that because of the deforestation taking place locally in the southern part of the Amazon forest, which, by the way, is the area which has had the biggest increase in maize and soy production in the last 20 years, we have actually lost already a month worth of rainfall. And this means most significantly that rather than having two crops in the same area, rain-fed crops per year, we can only have one crop per year. And so you can imagine how much, what's the impact of that on the ability to provide food. Also, based on our knowledge of the local impact of deforestation, taking out global climate change, global warming, we have modeled what are the expected changes in food production up to 2050 if we continue this high level of deforestation in Brazil and this increase in deforestation in Brazil. And so our conclusion here is that for the new areas converted, so you have forest, and let's suppose, just for the sake of argument, we are not producing any value, any economic value from that area. If you deforest, of course, you now have cattle, now you have crops, and so you can produce some value in those nearly deforested areas. And we have estimated that to be about $20 billion US dollars in net present value. However, the total loss in agriculture because of that newly converted areas is actually 185 billion US dollars. So for every hectare you cut down in forest to increase production, you actually lose 9 hectares worth of production elsewhere. So it's not a win-win or even a win-lose scenario where you might have some benefits here and some, problems there. We actually, it's a lose-lose scenario because the advance of the agricultural frontier, especially in the Amazon, is threatening food security globally. And that would lead us to a concept which actually found in the literature, which is the food security envelope. Where we must take into consideration our technology today and also what are our current climate. So the ability, of course, to have food production within certain temperature ranges and certain rainfall regimes. And also we must have to take into consideration the increase of food demand expected in the next decades. And so, which is basically the green area here that shows that if climate change keeps mitigated and also we have a slight increase or a controlled increase in food demand, we are okay in terms of food security for the future. However, if we don't take into account climate change, and actually both globally and regionally, we might actually have a smaller and smaller safe area in terms of food production, just because the ability of the Earth system to produce food is going to be much more threatened. And here, I must emphasize that there has been very intense research in Brazil and elsewhere to adapt crops to higher temperatures and to adapt crops to dry climate, but there are limits. There are physiological limits to that. So if we put our bets in the ability to come with a new GMO maize crop and soybean crop for this kind of environment, we might actually be in a very risky position. And this happens especially that if in addition to climate change, we also have a significant increase, as we are seeing today, in meat-based diets, which has a much bigger footprint in the global food systems than a more vegetable-based diet. Well, luckily, we already have some interesting movements taking place in different countries to tackle that. And so, for instance, I would like to cite, the legislation in France, which is very powerful because it not only prohibit company to buy food or from other countries with deforestation, but if a French company, for example, a French supermarket in Brazil buys products linked to deforestation and sell it to Brazilians, is also accountable. And that's why actually one of the biggest French supermarkets right now is being sued for doing exactly that. Also, we have a UK legislation that has already passed and a European Union legislation that just passed last week to prevent the import of deforestation. And China has also been moving in the right direction with that. There has been different internal documents connecting the ecological civilization with the importance of cleanup supply chains globally. And also we have this very important EU and USA and China joint declaration, which has as one of its main objectives to stop importing products linked to illegal deforestation. So the pieces are there, and I believe very strongly that we can work together, and China in this has a very important role to clean up supply chains globally and ensure not only the mitigation of climate change, but also food security. So conclusions here. First of all, deforestation-free trade is key to mitigating climate change, especially when we consider that, total emissions, about 20% of those are linked to deforestation, part of that to agriculture, and also to maintaining ecosystem services, most of them linked to biodiversity, which are very crucial for food production, such as rainfall, pollination, and also the bioeconomy, which is very important, especially to bring value and to bring, income for forest communities. Deforestation, especially in Brazil right now, we have very hard and strong evidence that it is a lose-lose game. We lose in terms of biodiversity, we lose in terms of climate change, and then we lose in terms of food production. So that's why we have been actually very strongly telling Brazilian farmers that what's going on in Brazil right now is actually agricultural suicide. They are actually acting against their own interest. But since those interests are well unbalanced, because the person who deforests directly is getting rich, while his neighbors are getting just slightly poorer, and the society as a whole is getting poorer, and we have here a very important role of the state in basically bringing harmony and bringing long-term vision for the whole country. And also, as that deforestation takes place, it increases the risk of food security, especially when we take into consideration global warming in a scenario of temperatures above 1.5 degrees. That's why in this scenario, international trade could be a driver of forest conservation globally, working in partnership with countries, especially Brazil. I think Brazil, Europe, and the United States and China are strong partners, are historical partners, and I think there is a lot of role here for a constructive, long-term perspective on forest conservation, climate change mitigation, and food production. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rajão. And he also tell us that we are facing a great challenge that we're gonna meet a lose-lose situation. So we need to pay attention to that. And then our last international stop will come back to Asia, where Ms. Demawati Zihedi, she is a government official from Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency of Indonesia. She focused on conducting the rehabilitation of mangrove and peatland ecosystem in Indonesia since 2015. And she's going to present with us her practice in Indonesia. And thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Okay, I would like to share our experience about mangrove rehabilitation in Indonesia, especially I will start with the mangrove condition in Indonesia. Indonesia has 4 important essential ecosystems, and some of them considered very fragile, such as karst, seagrass, peatland, and also mangrove. And if we see from 16.53 billion hectare total area of mangrove of the world, nearly 20% of the world mangrove area is Indonesia, and the existing total is 3 million hectare, and the potential is 756,000 hectare. Yeah, this is the fact about Indonesia biodiversity. We have 70,000 islands with various type of habitat, and also rich of flora and fauna. 10% of total flowering plant species of the world, and 12% of total mammal species. And if we see the mangrove important ecosystem services, it's for climate regulation. Mangrove important to storage the capacity of both in their biomass and in the soil. And it's also support for nursing ground and important living places for various type of fish. It's also provision of forest product production. It's also the cause of the from abrasion, tsunami, waves, strong wind, and others. This is the mangrove protection problem that now we face in Indonesia, and the most deforestation occur is in other use area. So if we see the peat deforestation in Indonesia, since the last 30 years, caused the loss of mangrove covering an area nearly 80,000 hectare, and projected deforestation from 2021 to 2030 is covering nearly 300 hectare. And this is the change from mangrove to non-mangrove is dominated by the shrimp pond. It's also threatened due to the mining activity that occur in upstream area. And if we see that the location has historically been vegetated with mangrove, but now it suffered heavy damage with condition worse than rare mangrove, so that mangrove vegetation is remain little or even completely lost. I would like to show the important role of Indonesian mangrove for carbon storage. This is, if we see the loss of mangrove in the last 3 decades has resulted in annual emission of 0.7 to 0.21 petatons of CO2, and avoiding mangrove conversion will reduce up to 30% of national emission from the land use sector. This result underscores the urgent need to protection and rehabilitation in Indonesia. Our study in 10 provinces shows that from Sumatra, Kalimantan, and Papua, there are some issues and challenges for mangrove. Converting the land use to palm oil plantation, also industrial forest, and also converting the land use for shrimp pond, and also mining that causing the abrasion. For instance, like in Sumatra, there is very massive tin mining that caused the degradation of the mangrove and also the shrimp pond. And the research also that conducted by Action for People Emancipation shows that there are also the activity of the coal mining in the upstream area, consists like 35 coal mining in Kalimantan that covering area more than 10,000 hectares within radius of 25 kilometers. is, in addition, at least 5 species in the critical endangered category in and around the mining area. Then the activity that occur in the upstream area will affect the coastal area. If we're referring to 2019 land cover data from Ministry of Environment, is activity that at least 19 mining companies have potential to pose a threat to the sustainability of mangrove ecosystem. The carbon absorption ability of the mangrove ecosystem around mining can reach at least nearly 250,000 ton carbon per year. So this is quite big. Now, the mangrove rehabilitation in Indonesia, we have started the campaign since 2020 by making president regulation and making the target action since 2020 until 2024. The mangrove rehabilitation by planting mangrove in forest area and other land use, together with other Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Coastal and Fisheries, local government, university. They have an indicative target since 2020 until 2024. And then this is the strategic plan for Ministry of Environment and Forestry. And since 2020, the President of Indonesia have established a peatland and restoration agency. Actually, it used to be only a peatland restoration agency since 2015 because of the massive fire in peatland area and caused a lot of haze. So since 2020, there's another task, so it become a peatland and mangrove restoration agency, and they give a specific target to rehabilitate 1,600,000 hectare within 4 years, and 1.2 million hectare for peatland area until 2024. And BRGM, Peatland Restoration Agency, coordinate with the Ministry of Environment and Forestry and also the Fisheries and Coastal Ministry to rehabilitate with the target specific area in 2022 until 2024. This is the mangrove ecosystem management roadmap. So since 2021 until 24, it's more like physical indicator. We are planting mangrove in some area with different method, silvopickery or other method. The achievement is covering 600,000 hectare with calculated from the total area of entire landscape that had been invented. And 2025 until 2027 is a pace for a sustainable mangrove management, and continue to 2028 to 30 for phases of sustainable mangrove management, and by the 30 is mangrove netting. So this is the rehabilitation target from 600,000 hectare divided in 9 provinces. So basically, this is the province that consider very fragile condition of the mangrove in North Sumatra, Riau Island, Kalimantan, and Papua. So this is the way how Peatland and Mangrove Restoration Agency propose the mangrove rehabilitation activity to do. So the landscape-based mangrove management is balancing competing land use interests so that mangrove protection for biodiversity can utilize for production. Also important to ensure that the management of coastal ecosystem become integral from terrestrial to coastal and mangrove on the coast. So the activity in upstream such as mining and plantation can be affected to mangrove ecosystem on the coast. So if we see, this is the example of mangrove landscape zoning arrangement. So it's like a sustainable land use planning for mangrove ecosystem. So we make a zonation for cultivation zone, for pond utilization, ecotourism, and then the second one is protected zone, so frame shield, for mangrove who facing the open sea, intensive rehabilitation, also protect coastline from abrasion. We also build some breakwater. And the second one is protected basin. This is the mangrove located in the swamp. It's also the riverine or the protected area, and then the mangrove green grove. So this is the way how we try to manage the development in the coastal area and terrestrial area. Okay, next, this is the conclusion, and my recommendation is that we have a lot of regulation. Actually, we have a lot of make a new regulation even in the district and village area. But the important thing, how to make the coordination and to make sure that the law enforcement between those stakeholders and the parties are consistent and work not singly but integrated with each other. And I think there is also a need to be moratorium or licensing and exploitation in the area that have a high conservation value. Especially even though in the protected area, sometimes the people still use it and then doing very destructive activity in that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you for all three speakers from this section. And they give us a tour from Africa to South America and then come back to Asia. And we also leave some time for questions and discussions. So we're going to have some chairs here, and we invite our three speakers to sit in front of us. And anyone, if you have question, you can prepare it. When you ask question, please make sure to make it concise and clear. And also, you can indicate who do you want to respond to your question. Yes, there's first.
Good morning. I am an environmental lawyer based in the United States, and my question is for Dr. Campbell. Knowing that there are several Chinese enterprises that are operating in the bauxite and iron mining industries in Guinea, what suggestions do you have for the Chinese government to ensure that these enterprises adhere to best practices for mitigating impacts on biodiversity, and especially given Guinea's weak rule of law and lack of oversight capacity?
Right. Thank you. We need a microphone here. Wait a moment. Okay.
Is it? It's on? Okay. Thank you for the question. So as I mentioned in the talk, so there's best practice standard that exists, and at the moment only a few Chinese banks do align with these standards. So I would encourage China to have more banks aligning with best practice standard, but also it's not just aligning, saying that you have adopted this best practice standard, it's also implementing these best practice standard that is sometimes difficult. So there need to be oversight also to make sure that these banks are funding projects that actually do that are implementing well the best practice standard, and also encouraging their company to follow these best practice standard. There could also be, because China do take a lot of bauxite to transform into alumina or aluminium, so they are a big importer of bauxite. So they could also try to have all companies that they buy from follow best practice, or there's also certification scheme for bauxite. So they could be first country to say we only have all certified bauxite. So there's a lot of different direction that the country can take to make sure there's the least impact possible on this population.
Yeah, I would like just to add to her point, which also applies to the issue of agriculture. Of course, in terms of growing consumption, Asia is on the spotlight. However, even now, Chinese banks and Asian banks have been growing. Most of the finance for large-scale infrastructure and to finance agricultural companies in Brazil and elsewhere is actually coming from Western banks, and also from the World Bank, from Inter-American Development Bank, from the Asian Bank, and even though those multilateral banks on paper are taking into consideration climate change, quite often on practice they don't do that. They don't monitor the contracts they give away to those big corporations, especially for big projects. If you don't have the involvement of, for instance, IFC, which is the private bank of the World Bank for large-scale infrastructure, you cannot actually do it. So I think it's also a matter of implementation, especially from Western banks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for the answers. Yeah, I think we have the second one is here. Yes.
Thank you very much. Ben Yassini from Malawi. I have a question to Professor Raon. I think the presentation focused on loss of biodiversity from trade, and that was particularly resulting to deforestation. I know, for example, in Brazil, we see it on the TV, fire is a big issue. I don't know what your take is on loss of biodiversity due to fires. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Fire is actually a means to convert land. That's often done in two stages. At first, as a way to reduce and to kill off the biggest trees and to do slow degradation, but also as you cut down the trees and then to finish up and to clean up so that you can put pasture on, you put fire again. There is fire used for agricultural purposes, especially by small farmers, but actually the larger areas linked to fire are linked to agricultural expansion. And unfortunately, what we have had in Brazil, it's a very explicit support of agricultural expansion, even if it's a lose-lose scenario, especially from the current government, and now changing, hopefully. And so what we have here is really this difficulty of explaining farmers and the agro-industry that if they want to think long-term, they should also switch away from fire and to more sustainable practice, and also conserve forests and restore forests rather than increase the area for agriculture.
And our third question.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. My name is Kirk Barlow. I'm from Canada, but I work with International Rivers, who is based in several places around the world. I have a question for Ms. Dharmawati. We do see a lot of in the work that we do the importance of free-flowing rivers. From development and protecting regions that basically accumulate sediment from good, healthy, free-flowing rivers. And we're just wondering what your organization is doing to protect rivers and educate the public on the importance of protecting rivers from development or pollution or whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, that's also the slide that I mentioned before, that we're conducting the rehabilitation and restoration of peatland and mangrove by village developing. So one of the important thing is how to make the people in that area understand why do they have to change their habit, why do they have to protect. So the education, also the information to the villagers, we also conducting in our organization. And also, we give training to the local government, also to make some regulation to protect the several area, including the river area. So they make what we call it the protected area that they cannot use it for developing, even for housing and for the agriculture. So for instance, what we have experienced in Papua. They have experienced 3 times they have to move to other village because of the abrasion near the coastal area close to the river. So when we came there, we educate, and then to make some local regulation, they totally agree, and they make the regulation that they have to protect at least 1 to 2 kilometers from the coastal area near to the river area to protect from the abrasion. So it's also applied to the investment come from out of the Papua especially there is a lot of massive tourism activity there. So with the regulation from the village regulation, it protected.
Thank you. And any more questions? It's maybe the lady in the middle.
Thank you. Thank you all of you for the great presentation. And I have a question for Professor Rajão. You've mentioned a lot of the proposals put forward by the many countries like the UK and China. I'm wondering if there are any specific and typical cases where there has been companies in the private sector has been applied to these proposals, and it would be better if it's related to the supply chain. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Actually, most of the largest agro companies, including COFCO, with the world's largest food company, which is Chinese, and Cargill, and JBS, and Marfrig, which is from the meat sector, and also the Chinese Import Meat Association, so it's from the business. They have been making commitments, especially to clean up supply chains from deforestation, usually pointing towards 2025, which is around the corner, and that's very positive. My concern here is how to implement that. Because if companies are going to do that alone, they are not going to be able to do that, especially because if you take, for instance, the case of cattle, which is a bit more complicated. Right now, most companies, and the same thing for soy, they are really monitoring and controlling from whom they are buying their soy and their cattle directly, so they know which is the farm they are buying from. However, quite often that farm is buying the cattle from somewhere else with deforestation, washing the cattle in a farm without deforestation, then selling it to the final destination. And there is no way for a private company to know those movements by itself. So what it needs is a data infrastructure. It's a monitoring system or traceability system from the governments, which then combine the different data sources and provide that level of transparency for private supply chains. In Brazil, we have been developing just that. We have in 2 states in Brazil, we are right now monitoring more than 1 million individual farms and aiming to not only monitor the direct transactions, but also the indirect transactions. And we are trying to convince the new government to bring it up to the federal level. And that could also become a model for the future and for the world. But repeating, I don't think the private sector is able to solve that alone. They need a data infrastructure from the public sector in order to make it possible.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions? I think we can take one last. Yeah.
Okay. Hello. My name is Ibrahim Khalil Bamba. I'm come from Guinea, West Africa. Mm-hmm. My question goes to Dr. Campbell, and maybe my colleague Josh will help me to translate in English. So,
tu peux parler en français aussi.
Ah, ok, merci. J'ai été très ravi que vous puissiez parler, articuler les impacts sur les chimpanzés dans mon pays. Mais malheureusement, je pense que le futur n'est pas est un peu sombre par rapport à la protection des chimpanzés à cause notamment de certains impacts dont vous avez parlé, notamment les projets hydroélectriques et les mines. Mais malgré, il y a d'avancées positives, notamment en termes de sensibilisation des acteurs internationaux et des entreprises aussi qui s'engagent pour la compensation écologique. Ma question, c'est de savoir que pensez-vous pensez-vous que l'éducation de ces acteurs internationaux peut contribuer justement à mieux prendre en compte la question de la protection des chimpanzés et quels sont les meilleurs messagers et quel peut être le rôle des communautés aussi dans la protection des chimpanzés d'Afrique de l'Ouest qui sont vraiment menacés. Merci.
Merci pour la question. Oui, c'est un problème qui est assez complexe et il y a beaucoup aussi de niveaux qu'on peut intervenir, donc au niveau des populations, au niveau des gouvernements, des financements internationaux ou des compagnies internationales qui viennent dans les pays pour faire leurs activités. Mais aussi un point que peut-être j'ai pas mentionné aussi, c'est un peu quand on essaie de prévenir l'impact, c'est d'essayer de planifier d'avance, donc de faire un plan de développement à l'échelle parce que chaque compagnie traite ses impacts vraiment dans un espace plus restreint, mais il faut vraiment voir l'impact cumulatif et voir à l'échelle du paysage comment on peut développer, mais aussi avec les communautés que le besoin des communautés reste intact. Donc, parfois aussi, la conservation va pas dans un intérêt. Si on crée un nouveau parc national sans consulter les communautés, on peut aussi faire que les communautés s'opposent un peu à la protection. Donc, il y a plusieurs niveaux qu'il faut bien considérer, mais c'est d'avoir une approche un peu plus globale, de faire la planification à l'échelle du paysage pour que tous les intérêts soient inclus et fonctionnent en harmonie.
Dr. Campbell, would you mind to speak in English
okay.
briefly, maybe?
Yeah. The question was just about that there is a lot of impact to chimpanzee. So the person is from Guinea, and so he's noticed impact of these industry on chimpanzees. And he said, at which level do you need to intervene to have a better impact and try to save these population of great ape? So I said there's really a different level at which you can intervene, which is the government level, the financing, the international company that's coming to these countries. But he also mentioned with the local community, so we need to make sure the local community see the interest in preserving these ape population. And I said one point I didn't mention in my talk is really when we try to plan and we anticipate impact, it's really important to do these landscape planning and make sure that the local population has a voice and contribute to where they want to preserve land that also benefit their daily life. So making sure they have clean water and preserve some forest tract that also benefit ape, but the local population, and where you put the development. So having more this landscape approach from the start is really important.
Thank you very much. And that's all the questions for today. And thank you very much for our three speakers and also for your questions that opens us more perspective to understand the question and understand the situation right now. And for this section, we have we learned that no matter from species level or ecosystem level, and also like for food industry, we all facing challenges globally. And also that no matter which continent, which country we are from, these threats, these challenges we are facing are all together from internationally. And also, I believe the solution are also from collaboration and from international cooperation. And thank you very much. And you can have a seat downstage.